Welcome folks to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. My name's Andy Baird and I'm the Deputy Director of Engagement here in TMAG as we call it. I'm standing outside one of the visitors' most popular galleries we've got here, Islands to Ice, the Great Southern Ocean and Antarctica. It's also an exhibition that I helped develop 15 years ago when I first came to TMAG, and so I thought we'd use it today to celebrate Museum Week and the theme of Together. And together really in this context allows us to explore how exhibitions are put on in a collaborative way. They're not just something that happens with the workers in TMAG, but they happen with the whole community of the sciences, the arts, the decorative arts, the humanities, all coming together to create this wonderful theme. Now, Islands to Ice really started, as I said, about 15, 17 years ago, where we had a government support for investing in showcasing Tasmania as the gateway to Antarctica. Back in Hobart many years ago, we had this Antarctic Adventure Dream World run commercial exhibition space, and that didn't survive the economic challenges at the time. And so the government wanted to invest in a new gallery and gave it to the museum to create it. Now, as a museum, we had a different approach to a Dreamworld theme park. Obviously, we wanted to bring together the collection and the objects. However, what's interesting about this gallery is that we didn't have a huge collection within the Antarctic area or the subantarctic or the Southern Ocean zones. So we had to kind of collaborate extensively with our community to build that collection. We also, at that time, built stories. Lots and lots of stories came in about the zone. And I guess I'd like to start one of the first places we explore some of those zones in an area here which we call the Perceptions Gallery or Theaterette. Perceptions is the name we've given it to it because it really is about those stories that people understood of Antarctica before they ever actually went to Antarctica. So we didn't have objects from those times. And what times am I talking about? Well, if you come in, you can see some of them. Some of those stories we've put, or we know from the oral record that's passed down from Trowena, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people's name for this gallery, this island. And I should actually just note, because we're talking about this deep, deep culture, to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people who continue to be the custodians of this land and the elders past, present and emerging. The stories from the Tasmanian Aboriginal culture were oral stories, and they went back 20,000 or more years ago, passed all the way down to people today. How do we know this? Well, we know it because of the people, the Tasmanian community today, writing these stories down from what they've heard from their ancestors. We also know that there were stories about Antarctica being named by the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, in honour of the bear constellation in the sky, and Arctos, which is the Latin or Greek for bear, as an anti or opposite to that. The Greeks had an idea that Antarctica would be a landmass that balanced the globe. How do we present those stories when we don't have any objects from that time? Well, we did it in an aesthetic and a storytelling way. So around the walls here, we've got an audio-visual developed by local Tasmanian artists that presents some of those perceptions of this place, right up to the time when the early explorers started to sail down to that area for commercial reasons of sealing and whaling, as well as for exploration. But I want to focus as well on this map that we commissioned local artist Matt Coyle. If you look at it, you can see that the map is in the style of a sort of 1600s map, and in fact we've got a 1600s map in the exhibition. But we wanted to throw into it not just what we could copy from that extant 1600s map, but from those stories. So we've got in the corner here a little example of sea monsters, kraken. We've got strange looking creatures. This was a time in the 1600s where this area was populated with stories of demons and the imagination. But we also had some real people's experience. This little canoe we've had Matt draw here shows Uti Rangatori, a Polynesian explorer who sailed down to where the sea was like arrowroot. That's a translation from the language. And what is the sea-like arrow? Well, if anybody's been down south, they know the frozen ocean, the sea ice, creates this very thick, soupy, slow-moving land or seascape. And so that's what we think, that this is perhaps the first actual person to go down into the sea ice zone. Of course, these stories were of the imagination. They were, until the 1700s, and perhaps with Uchi Rangaturi's story, they were not written down. But in 1772 to 75 rather, Captain Cook was the first person to circumnavigate this area. And that's where we leave the perceptions gallery and go into the areas of the exhibition where we have material objects. But we don't want to leave those stories for the rest of the museum experience here. We did want to bring in those arts. We wanted to bring in the sense that the stories remain an important part of this gallery. And we commissioned a local poet, Anthony Lawrence, to create some poetry of these areas. Now, for those who can't see that easily, I'll just read it out. These are little haikus throughout the exhibition. The tails were taller than the ships that they ate, those 8-armed rogues of horror. Bouncing off that kraken, that giant squid theme. We've got another one across here where we start dealing with the Southern Ocean. Again, a difficult place to present objects to because a bucket of water, but we again try and evoke that with another haiku here. Men stare, wires sing, all hands on deck when the 40s are roaring. That's referring to the roaring 40s, the latitude at which the Southern Ocean begins and heads south. The exhibition in this part here brings in the collaborations we had with other industries as well. Not just the artists, not just the historians we've mentioned, but the fishing industry. Up high here you can see some taxidermed or stuffed specimen of albatross. We've got shy, black-backed and black-backed albatross here. The Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery is one of the first institutions in Australia to have a non-lethal collection policy. We don't go out and shoot our animals for the displays or for the collection. And these birds came to us from the fishing industry's experiments and trying to understand the bycatch of the longline fishing. These birds were caught on longline fishing lines. These are lines out the back of trawlers that go up tens of kilometres long, and they're set, and the birds fly down and feed on the bait, get caught on the line and the hook, and then when the bait sinks into the water, they drown. So we, at the time of putting the exhibition on, had barrels of these poor birds. What's interesting as part of that experiment is that the fishing industry are not interested in catching albatross. For all of Samuel Coleridge's challenges around the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you might recall, they want tuna, they want other fish that are deep sea fish. And so the scientists and the observers on those boats and the fishing industry work together to work out how to reduce the bycatch for the benefit of the birds and the benefit of the fishing industry. And they did that in simple ways. They used fresh, not frozen bait. They weighted the fishing line so that it sunk quicker, that the frozen bait, which would normally float, as I said, was fresh, so it would sink into the ground. They laid the lines at an angle and put them straight into the water quicker than shooting them off the back of the boat higher up. And they also laid the lines at night when these birds were not able to see the baits. And that dramatically decreased the bycatch, which is very useful. What we can see here as well is just a bit of a backstory on how museums present some of these animals of the deep ocean, because whilst we can taxiderm fur and feathers quite easily, it's very hard to taxiderm the fleshy soft skins of fish. And most fish you see in museums are either wet specimens in bottles or they're moulds and casts. And we see two here which are significant in the conservation agenda of this display here, the Patagonian toothfish and the orange roughy, both fish species that are managed for their numbers and their conservation status now, coming from the knowledge of the science experiments. We, in this gallery, had to talk to a lot of people, the fisheries, the scientists on those boats, some of the researchers from the expeditions that go down to Antarctica and the subantarctic islands. And I want to show you one experiment that the TMAG itself was part of with the Australian Antarctic Division, who are the organisation that equips expeditioners going south. And that's around the corner here, in a display that's sometimes not often looked at. We keep some of these specimens in drawers because they're light sensitive, and obviously you can't have them on display with the lights, even the soft lights of the gallery. I want to point out this herbarium specimen sheet here of a plant that was gathered in quite a unique way. When expeditioners come to Hobart, getting ready to go on the boat down south to Antarctica, or in this case they were heading to Macquarie Island, they normally have all their clothing and provisions, and they get on the boat and down they go. Well, the scientists did an experiment. They wanted to understand what potential seeds or biological material was going down to these remote and relatively pristine areas. And they took the clothing of the expeditioners before they got on the ship to go south, checked out all the pockets and the little bits of fluff and seeds caught on the Velcro and in those sharp cornered pockets of raincoats and things, and filtered out the fluff, propagated the seeds and grew this plant. Now this plant wasn't known to many of the scientists here in Australia, and they brought it to our herbarium, the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery's herbarium, and we identified what it was. And it was an invasive knapweed from North America. It was on the clothing of a Texan expeditioner, a scientist, and it was heading down towards this location, this subantarctic island of Macquarie Island, where you can see this magnificent specimen of wandering albatross. Now that experiment told us that that very invasive weed, knapweed, causes up to $2 billion of economic loss per annum in America because it has spread across the grasslands. We didn't want, nobody wanted, that very invasive species to get down there and potentially affect this pristine habitat of Macquarie Island. So in the end, the scientists recommended changes to the way the quarantining works, to the cleaning of jackets, and in particular to the design of the jackets. No longer was Velcro to be used on coats going to Macquarie Island. No longer were the pockets, those sharp cornered pockets, they were sewn rounded. It started changing the fashion of the Antarctic industry. And you can see right up in the corner of the gallery here, we've just got two examples of clothing from across eras, where right up high you can see something from the older Munson type of era right down to the Antarctic clothing of today. There's many collaborative moments. One that's a favourite of mine is this one here, because collaboration doesn't stop once an exhibition goes up. This object was on display, and 3 years ago we gave a tour to the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, the subgroup of the humanities and social sciences, and one of the people on that tour looked at this object, which we hadn't got a lot of knowledge about. It was found on Herbarium Island, one of the subantarctic islands, and the knowledge, all we had really was that it was likely to have been carved by someone down on that island. And remember, this is a non-occupied island now. It's a transient island where people used to go to seal and whale in the 1800s. And the researcher could point out, and we've added it now to the collection records, that this was most likely created by a group that was shipwrecked on that island, the shipwreck of the Trinity in 1880 to 1882, and those sailors were stuck on that island for 15 months. They would have had time to carve this. Now, I originally used to say this looks a bit Norwegian, but in fact the sailors on that ship were Americans and Portuguese. So it was quite a different kind of storyline than what we had supposed just by looking at the facial form. So I think now it's highly likely to be carved by one of those American or Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Trinity in 1880. We've also got another piece of found objects from down there, but this one is slightly different. When we were putting out a call amongst the science community for objects, we got a call from the Bureau of Meteorology here in Hobart, and they found this large object on the west coast of Tasmania. Now you might say, well, yeah, west coast of Tasmania, but we're trying to talk about the Antarctic and the subantarctic. Well, in fact, this was an ice buoy that had been put into the ice down in the Antarctic area by a German university, and as the sea ice breaks up and melts across the summer, it sends back its data, it was satellite connected ice buoy, to the researchers back in Germany. Now unfortunately that particular ice buoy only had a very short life. There was some technical failing and it ended up floating as debris, as detritus for about 10 years until it landed on the west coast of Tasmania, and we flew it in and have put it into this exhibition here. And again, it's talking about this kind of expansive community of people who have involvement in the Antarctic, subantarctic and the Southern Ocean. And these Bureau of Meteorology, these German university people helped us create a storyline where we can also here talk about marine debris in that environment. Let's go over to the actual Antarctic continental section, and we'll have just a look at one perhaps of the, well, it's really the oldest object that's in this gallery. Apart from the rocks, that is. So the gallery, as I said, is full of objects from the human endeavours down in Antarctica, which is around 200 years. It's been as long as humans have actually been there. But in this freezer unit here, can't see it very easily, but I'll describe it, is an ice core. Now this ice core was taken from the continental ice of Antarctica about 200 metres down into the ice, which makes it about 300 years old. So apart from the rocks that we've got in this gallery, this is the oldest object we've got in here, and it's just water, just frozen water. Why have we put a piece of frozen water into the gallery? What's so important about that? Well, we got this from the University of Tasmania and the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Sciences, and it tells the story of carbon dioxide levels, because that's one of the key things that Antarctic scientists research. They research what the global climate conditions were like as recorded in the ice. We've got trapped little air bubbles from hundreds and thousands of years ago in the ice. This little example, the air in the bubbles inside this little piece of ice here, are 300 years old. If you study the carbon dioxide levels in there and compare it to today, you can see that dramatic change which we know is caused by human-induced global climate change. So we can see those things in the real record from the ice. Over here we pick up the story of other people who have collaborated on this museum, not as organisations but as individuals. And here I just want to point out one tin, because this came to us from a call out to old expeditioners, people who had been down to Antarctica from the 1950s onwards, and this Fry's pure concentrated cocoa tin was souvenired by a chap called David Johns. And David, when he told me about this, and he was a bit apologetic, because he, as I said, he'd souvenired it from Captain Robert Falcon Scott's Cape Evans hut in Antarctica. Now he, as a 1950s young man, had been down there doing other work, and you know, in that era it was probably a little bit laissez-faire about people thinking, well, nobody else is going to come here and take this object, so he would. Of course, as he got older, he realised the importance of leaving things in situ, in their own locations. He couldn't get back to Antarctica, so he gave it to us to the museum. And that's from Scott's expedition. Now, Scott was renowned, as we all know, as being part of the race to the South Pole, and he died in Antarctica in 1912. Also on Scott's expedition was, but didn't die because he was part of the different crew, was Frank Debenham. And Frank Debenham owned these globes here. Again, when we put out the call for the exhibition, we had a collector from Bowral, New South Wales, which is where Frank Debenham was from, who had these globes that Frank had used in his studies. They didn't go down to Antarctica, but they were a terrestrial and a celestial globe, and these are very old globes. These are from the 1800s. This one here, the terrestrial globe, is true to about 1817. Again, we've had to build this collection from the donations, from the gifts, from the knowledge of all these different people. It's very much an exhibition that came together. But this other object, and perhaps one of our pride objects in this gallery, was one we've had in the collection since the late 1800s. Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery is the second oldest museum in Australia. And this came to us in the late 1800s, in 1898, and we believe it's possibly the oldest Antarctic vehicle extant anywhere in the world. It was used by Carsten Borchgrevink in 1898, and that was the first wintering party to to spend the time on the Antarctic continent in 1898. We came to he sailed back into to Hobart rather, and that's likely where the museum director and him met, and this was part of our collection ever since then. I've got only two more objects I'd like to show you and two more stories to tell. One of them is how the way stories change and objects change their meaning. Here we've got a little display about some of the whaling stories from the Antarctic, and you can see this very twisted harpoon, twisted by the sheer force of that whale as it wriggled and swam and dived and turned to get away from the whalers. It's a story that's very evocative of our regard now for whales, and Australia has been one of the premier nations to try and protect whales through the International Whaling Commission. And this little display here tells a story. Whilst not all people are protecting whales, and you can see a tin here of whale meat from a Japanese retail market, which we had bought for us in Japan, right through to these ancient twisted remnants of whaling and also of the whaler's life, which is through the scrimshaw here. An exhibition like this doesn't just land out of nowhere. We try and make it a place-based exhibition as well. Why are we doing this here in Tasmania? What's important about Antarctica to Tasmania? Well, if you look out the window where we've sited this gallery, and unfortunately it's still autumn, so all the leaves haven't fallen from this tree, but out the window where we're looking now is the docks of Hobart. And it's from these docks that the sailors have and still do go down to Antarctica, across the Southern Ocean, go to the subantarctic islands. And we've positioned directly in front of this harbour, this view of the waterfront entrance and gateway to Antarctica, some of the footage we've collaborated and got from the National Archives of Australia and Film Australia, which is Sir Douglas Mawson, perhaps Australia's most famous Antarctic explorer, who sailed out from these docks that are out of the window down to Antarctica. And this footage by Frank Hurley, very famous Australian photographer, of that expedition in 1911 to 1914, started right here in Hobart, out the window where we can still see. It's on about a 15-minute loop, and it shows just some of the struggles, firstly of provisioning the ships, sailing out the harbour here, and then obviously, as you can see here, setting up a polar pyramid tent on the Antarctic in what was regarded as one of the windiest places possible. We'll wrap this exhibition brief tour and talk about how it's a collaborative environment and a place where we work together to put on these stories, with that reflection back of bringing the sciences and the arts together to try and understand these zones. We have a display here which is one of the changing displays in this gallery. As I said, the gallery's been here for 15 years, but this display constantly changes because we feature not just the scientists and their work, but we wanted to feature what the artists are showing us of Antarctica. And right here we've got a little display of John Kelly, an artist, a painter, who has been down to Antarctica as part of the Australian Antarctic Arts Fellowship to capture a bit of the feeling of Antarctica, not just the data and the knowledge, but that feeling that you get out of an artist's impressions. There's a beautiful photo which is on this board, which I hope we can see together, which is John actually drawing the penguin that is observed. We've split it up with some of the graphic, but he's watching this penguin, and we can see his sketch notes that he has, his sketch pad, his filled sketch pad from Antarctica. It's a beautiful way of us being able to share some of those ongoing different perceptions in Antarctica. So I hope this gives you a very tiny little glimpse of how we put on an exhibition in terms of the collaboration and of how we rely on a broad community, not just the scientists that work within TMAG, not just the humanitarian curators that work within TMAG, but that broad community that is involved in working with a museum exhibition. So thank you for joining us, and thank Veronica, who's standing behind the camera there. And maybe you can also join us next week for another Facebook Live on TMAG, another mystery tour. Thank you.